The setting: the American maritime and offshore fishing industry. In the United States, the vastness of the nation's maritime borders has been both a blessing and a challenge. Stretching from the icy waters of the northern Atlantic to the balmy currents of the Gulf of Mexico and the sweeping expanse of the Pacific, America's coastline is among the longest in the world. This geographical fortune established the United States as a dominant force in global seafaring and fishing, especially by the late 20th century. The ocean wasn't just a natural boundary, it was a heartbeat of commerce, culture, and tradition, fueling local economies from the rugged shores of Alaska to the bustling docks of New England and the sun-baked harbors of California. By the early 1990s, the offshore fishing industry had grown exponentially. State-of-the-art trawlers, longliners, and processing ships roamed farther into international waters, lured by schools of tuna, cod, pollock, and countless other species that supported both domestic consumption and a booming export market. This pursuit for bigger hauls and higher profits saw American fleets venturing into the farthest reaches of the Pacific and North Atlantic, even as competition from international vessels intensified. Yet, behind the facade of prosperity and maritime might lay a labyrinth of challenges. Overfishing in coastal zones, augmented by factors like climate change and pollution, forced fleets to sail further from American shores, transforming offshore from a regional term to a truly global concept. The offshore grounds were remote, dangerous, and loosely regulated. A world unto themselves where laws sometimes blurred and enforcement became challenging. Disputes over quotas, territories, and fishing rights with other nations, notably Canada, Russia, and Japan, occasionally flared into diplomatic incidents or tense standoffs at sea. The growing reach of the industry couldn't be maintained by the domestic workforce alone. Labor shortages, exacerbated by the nature of the work, which was grueling, hazardous, and often isolated for months at a stretch, pushed companies to seek out immigrant labor. Workers arrived not just from Latin America but from Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and China, lured by the promise of wages far beyond what they could earn at home. This mix of languages, traditions, and socioeconomic backgrounds created a workforce as diverse as the cargoes they hauled, but also planted seeds for misunderstanding, exploitation, and at times outright conflict. At the same time, advances in technology, GPS navigation, satellite communications, refrigeration, and automated machinery, made it feasible for vessels to operate further from home for longer durations. But this technological leap also introduced layers of complexity and sometimes heightened the alienation of crews, as companies squeezed more work out of fewer hands. Enforcement of safety regulations and labor standards struggled to keep pace, especially out in international waters where U.S. jurisdiction grew thin. Media coverage often painted a picture of romantic adventure, the last wild frontier, rugged men and sometimes women, living at the edge of the world. Documentaries and news pieces showcased heroic rescues, record-breaking catches, and picturesque sunrises over storm-tossed decks. But beneath the surface, stories circulated, quietly at first, about wage theft, deprivation, unsafe working conditions, and the psychological toll of extended months at sea. When accidents happened, investigations stalled in red tape or were hindered by remoteness. When violence broke out, it often went unreported or unheard, lost in the static between ship and shore. By the mid-1990s, congressional hearings and investigative journalism began to shine a spotlight on the darker underbelly of the industry. Labor abuses, human trafficking, and cases of extreme violence erupted into public view. These stories set off waves of regulatory scrutiny, public debate, and policy proposals, but meaningful protection for many seafarers remained frustratingly elusive, especially for foreign workers who feared retaliation, job loss, or deportation if they spoke out. The atmosphere aboard some vessels became a microcosm of the larger pressures squeezing the industry: fierce competition, shrinking margins, and the collision of cultures all playing out in the claustrophobic, high-stakes environment of a working ship. Skirmishes over assignments or grievances could escalate quickly, sometimes with deadly results. The drama and danger were constant companions, and every journey offshore carried not only the hope of a fat payday, but also the real risk that something could go very, very wrong, far from the safe harbors of the American dream. The vessel of fate, SS Pama was an imposing presence even among the behemoths that traversed the open waters of the Alaskan fishing grounds. Stretched out over 165 feet, The ship was built not only for endurance but also for efficiency, combining the latest maritime technology with old-school toughness that mirrored the expectations of her corporate owners. Officially, SS Pama sailed under a Panamanian flag of convenience, chosen for the lax regulatory oversight and tax benefits, but her operational nerve center was situated in Seattle, Washington, deeply woven into America's powerful seafood industry. The design of the SS Pama reflected the brutal pragmatism of the industry: 3 main decks, each tightly purposed. The lowest deck, unreachable to daylight, was home to the massive diesel engines, humming round the clock, and the cavernous refrigerated storage holds where thousands of pounds of fish could be packed and preserved for weeks at sea. Above, the second deck housed cramped bunks, a communal mess hall always tinged with the scent of frying fish, and basic recreational corners, ages-old vending machines, battered playing cards, and sometimes the soft blue gloom of a television set replaying DVDs. Here, American supervisors, immigrant deckhands, and technicians from multiple continents jostled daily for elbow room, sleep, and slivers of privacy. The uppermost deck was the domain of the officers: bridge, navigation, captain's quarters, offices, radio rooms filled with blinking lights and the insistent ping of marine traffic updates. The whole atmosphere was a peculiar mix: high-tech control in the wheelhouse, functional grit everywhere else. SS Pama's mission was more than routine. She was one cog in a large, complex logistical chain that supplied fresh and frozen fish, from pollock to salmon and cod, primarily to U.S. West Coast distribution terminals, and to a lesser extent, export concerns in Asia and Europe. Departing on each voyage meant committing to months offshore. Every inch of her hull spoke to that demand, reinforced against ice, equipped with GPS, sonar arrays, satellite uplinks, and mechanized trawl winches that sometimes dwarfed the crew members tasked with operating them. But despite the sophistication and imposing exterior, life on board SS Pama was shaped by claustrophobia, fatigue, and the relentless tempo set by quota and weather. The company that owned her was infamous in both legal filings and rumor mills, a reputation for cutting costs, enforcing non-negotiable discipline, and quietly sourcing crew from labor contractors who specialized in recruitment across economic hardship regions in Asia, Central America, and occasionally the American South. As a result, the crew roster was an intricate mosaic: Pacific Islanders, Vietnamese, Guatemalans, Americans both native and naturalized, and on this fateful voyage, a contingent of seasoned Chinese fishermen who bore the highest hope and the greatest vulnerability. SS Pama's outfitting made her a fortress and a prison. Security protocols were austere to prevent theft, escape, and mutiny. Mandatory ID checks, segregated access between crew and officers' quarters, CCTV surveillance, and a rulebook that threatened termination, or worse, for infractions. The company had recently issued a new policy requiring sizable security deposits from foreign recruits, ostensibly as a guarantee against desertion mid-contract. This policy was controversial, rumored to have kept some families back home in debt bondage until it was returned at journey's end. The ship's departure from the bustling port of San Pedro, California, was an event in itself, watched by union stewards, rival contractors, and the curious. After provisioning with food, fuel, and yet more replacement gear, the SS Pama took on additional crew at a stopover in Honolulu, where the bulk of the Asian workers boarded, with tense goodbyes, clutched papers, and anxious phone calls home. From that moment forward, Hawaii was but a rumor of land, quickly replaced by weeks of spray, ice, monotony, and, as always, the unseen tension of men locked together with ambition and anxiety as their only true cargo. The crew and principal characters. The SS Pama's population was a study in cultural and personal contrasts, thrown together by circumstance and the harsh economics of the modern fishing trade. At the top of the ship's pecking order sat an all-American management and command structure, grizzled veterans of the maritime industry, with resumes that included countless string-lining seasons, union disputes, and brushes with both U.S. and foreign authorities. Captain Jack Miller, a 38-year-old Massachusetts native, had spent 2 decades at sea. His reputation was a double-edged sword: legendary seamanship and iron-fisted rule combined with a notorious temper. Several seasons before, he'd weathered a formal inquiry after being implicated in an altercation that left a Mexican deckhand hospitalized with permanent injuries. The company, valuing his ability to keep ships productive and crews in line, kept him in command after he submitted a letter of apology and quietly settled with the victim's family. He now supervised every aspect of the SS Pama's journeys with the unwavering expectation of order and results. Second in command was Mark Lee, a calm and thoughtful officer of Chinese-American descent, known for his ability to mediate and keep tempers from flaring out of control. Lee's steadying hand earned the trust of immigrant workers, but he remained loyal to Miller, often caught between the hard realities of management and the struggles of the crew. Then came Will Johnson, the Chief Operations Officer, a former Marine with a build as imposing as his voice, and a penchant for interpreting discipline with alarming literalism. Johnson, more than anyone else, was the face of authority on the main deck, moving among the workers with a swagger that veered into outright bullying. He was responsible for daily quotas, work assignments, and the ever-present threat that any infraction, real or perceived, could bring both verbal and physical consequences. Chief Cook Tom Parker, an affable but wily Southerner, and a handful of veteran American and Filipino technicians rounded out the senior ranks, lording over the technical, culinary, and maintenance operations with authority that stopped only at the captain's door. Below them was a kaleidoscope of humanity. Americans from struggling Rust Belt towns, recent immigrants from Central America and Asia, and a rotating contingent of contract workers from China and the Philippines. This latter group, often recruited via agencies in Los Angeles or Seattle, represented a microcosm of global migration. Young men escaping rural poverty, middle-aged laborers seeking a final windfall before returning home, and even a few seasoned maritime mercenaries willing to tolerate anything the sea could throw at them. Among the Chinese crew on this particular voyage, the unofficial leader was David Zhou, a 45-year-old former teacher from Henan who'd come to America seeking economic salvation for his ailing mother and 3 children. Zhou's English, fragmentary but precise, and his only modest experience at sea made him the default mediator between nervous rookies and the inscrutable, often hostile American management. His crew included Wei Shu, a farm laborer with hands calloused from both land and sea, Li Huang, a quick-witted but anxious former machinist, Min Chen, a genial giant with a knack for fixing things, several recent arrivals whose inexperience was only surpassed by their desperation. For all of them, the promise was the same: wages 3 or 4 times what they could ever make at home, and the possibility, remote but real, of sending enough money back to change the course of their families' lives. The price, though, was steep: a steep security deposit deducted up front, ironclad non-disclosure clauses, and the risk of months on an indifferent sea far from any help. This patchwork crew, under the command of the stern American hierarchy, had to carve out a measure of trust and mutual dependence. All while the engines hummed, the quotas loomed, and the horizons stretched empty in every direction. They would soon discover that while fish may be the main catch, the real dangers on SS Pama were often the people they sailed with. Ironclad rules in the first trial. Life aboard the SS Pama was governed by an intricate, unyielding web of rules, a thick manual of do's and don'ts that every crew member was made to read, sign, and acknowledge before the ship even left the dock. These regulations weren't simply company suggestions nor benign reminders of common sense. They were binding and at times punishingly strict, designed as much to assert dominance as to ensure efficiency and safety in an environment that offered little room for error or dissent. First and foremost were the contract provisions. Every worker, whether American or foreign, was required to sign a draconian contract. Its fine print stacked with clauses about conduct, loyalty, and penalties for breach. Immigrant workers in particular were subjected to additional requirements, steep security deposits that would only be refunded at the successful completion of their contracts, threats of blacklisting for mutiny or desertion, and clauses that effectively barred them from seeking outside help if problems arose on board. The company lawyer walked them through the documents, always with an air of well-rehearsed indifference, emphasizing the fairness and necessity of these conditions. More than a few crewmen privately wondered if they'd truly had a choice. Beyond paper, the day-to-day reality was a regime of constant surveillance and discipline. The moment a new crew member crossed the gangway, they were issued coded ID cards and assigned bunks, uniforms, and color-coded badges that dictated where they could eat, sleep, and even use the bathroom. CCTV cameras watched over every communal space except the showers and toilets. The threat of being written up or cited for even minor transgressions was ever present. Will Johnson, the Chief Operations Officer, personally oversaw the drilling of new recruits. Safety offenses could result in fines, docked pay, or in extreme cases, immediate dismissal and debarkation at the nearest port, regardless of the crew member's nationality or circumstances. For foreign recruits, it meant starting all over again, often with mounting debts back home. Work discipline was enforced with military precision. At 5:30 each morning, the ship's loudspeakers blared reveille, a cacophony of static, alarms, and sometimes country music that startled everyone out of bed. Each crewman had 10 minutes to report for roll call on the middle deck. Latecomers were penalized, and any sloppiness in uniform or personal hygiene was met with public rebuke. Maintenance drills, knot-tying competitions, and safety exercises filled the first hours of every voyage, regardless of rough seas or jet lag. The rules dictated not just the what, but the how. Fish had to be gutted and packed within 12 minutes of landing on deck, breaks were strictly timed, and everyone was expected to log their work in detail at the end of each shift. The first trial always came early, usually before the ship even reached open water. On the initial voyage, it came in the form of grueling training sessions for the new immigrant workers. Many had never set foot on a boat this size, let alone operated its machinery or endured its punishing schedule. Johnson's boot camp tactics left little room for compassion. Seasick or not, sleep-deprived or reeling from culture shock, recruits were forced to master every task from basic safety protocols to the complex ballet of operating mechanized trawl winches. Barked orders, "Faster, don't daydream, we can't make quota at this speed," echoed down the steel corridors as the American veterans watched, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with resentment. Those who lagged behind were shouted at, belittled, or in some cases physically prodded along. Iron discipline here meant the expectation of unflinching obedience. Only a few, like David Zhou, the oldest in the Chinese crew and a quick study, were spared the brunt of the humiliation thanks to prior experience and their usefulness as intermediaries. For the rest, the first week blurred into a haze of exhaustion, disappointment, and often the dawning realization that this contract came at greater cost than many had ever imagined. The command staff and key personnel aboard on the SS Pama, the hierarchy and attitudes of the command staff defined the experience of every crew member. At the ship's pinnacle was Captain Jack Miller, a 38-year-old New Englander whose reputation was forged on icy Atlantic crossings and volatile stints off the West Coast. Miller radiated discipline and was notorious for his hot temper. Stories about his past altercations, ranging from brawls in Alaskan ports to confrontations with disgruntled deckhands, circulated in whispers through every crew shift. Despite his checkered record, the corporate owners valued his unyielding ability to deliver quotas and maintain order, sometimes at morale's expense. Second in command, First Mate Mark Lee was a study in contrast. Of Chinese-American descent, Lee had an intuitive understanding of the multicultural fabric that now made up much of the American maritime workforce. His style was firm, yet diplomatic. He frequently brokered compromises between raw immigrant recruits and cold, demanding officers. Though respected by many of the foreign crew, Lee struggled inwardly with the demands of loyalty both to the ship's mission and the dignity of its people. The third power on SS Pama was Will Johnson, the chief operations manager, a hulking former Marine whose military training translated into relentless enforcement of shipboard rules. On deck, Johnson became the face of American command, barking instructions, conducting drill sessions at any hour, and never hesitating to mete out discipline with his voice or his fists. Workers saw him as both a taskmaster and a looming threat. Even seasoned hands tread carefully around his territory. Rounding out the senior team were the heads of specialized divisions, Tom Parker, the chief cook, whose southern warmth and quick wit made the mess hall the one refuge from the ship's ever-present tension, and technical leads like Filipino-born engineer Tony Baltazar and American deck chief Scott Hansen, each with decades of mechanical and practical expertise. Their leadership shaped not only work routines but also set the tone for off-duty interactions and alliances on board. The command staff's presence was omnipresent. Every morning, Miller and Johnson conducted roll calls and safety briefings with military precision. Parker's voice called out meal times, and Lee's measured words smoothed the worst of disputes, translating grievances before they became open rebellion. But even their best efforts were often undermined by corporate directives from Seattle, insisting on harsher productivity targets, stricter penalties for mistakes, and tighter surveillance to control the ship's polyglot workforce. Complicating everything was the ship's practice of recruiting via labor contractors. Many key positions beneath the officer corps were filled by men and women whose papers had been processed by agencies in LA, Houston, or distant overseas affiliates. These ranks included a large contingent of Chinese and Southeast Asian workers, joined by Central American and even Appalachian Americans, for whom the old fishing towns offered no more opportunities. For the lower ranks, the command staff were both bosses and gatekeepers, controlling not just their daily fate but often their hopes for earning enough to remake a life back home. This swirling mesh of authority, expectation, and daily danger made the SS Pama a cauldron, where every decision by a manager could spark new tensions, every order from the bridge might push someone closer to the breaking point, and every waking hour was a reminder that in international waters, real power belonged to those with the keys to the bridge and a direct line to Seattle's lawyers. Early days, adrift, dissent, and violence. From the first dawn that SS Pama left the sight of land, a restless undercurrent spread among her crew. The open water brought a strange silence to the deck, but below, behind closed doors and in the narrow labyrinth of shared quarters, a different kind of turbulence brewed. For many of the immigrant deckhands, their dreams of earning a fortune abroad were immediately clouded by the harsh realities of life at sea. Most had known difficult labor before, but nothing had prepared them for the marathon intensity demanded by Pama's officers. Instructions were barked in English at a relentless pace, often infused with impatience or outright ridicule. Many of the new hires, particularly those from rural regions of China and Southeast Asia, were still struggling with basic seafaring lingo. The American and Filipino supervisors expected instant obedience, and when questions arose, they took them as signs of defiance or incompetence instead of confusion. Misunderstandings flared, tempers began to fray, and the language barrier turned every simple mistake into a potential flashpoint. The official rules on board were more than just regulations, they were a fortress. Violations, even accidental, met with instant and public reprimand. Will Johnson, the chief operations officer, became a specter haunting work details. He prowled the deck, his mere presence enough to steal the confidence of the greenest hands. When a job wasn't completed perfectly or on time, he made examples. A snatched meal privilege here, an extra shift there, or a verbal lashing delivered in front of the entire crew. The ship's CCTV cameras meanwhile stripped away any hope of privacy, fostering an atmosphere where even the smallest slip-up felt like a capital offense. The physical toll surfaced quickly. Sleeplessness, raw nerves, and the constant ache of battered muscles. But emotional strain weighed even heavier. Veterans like David Joe tried to mediate disputes and keep the team united. Still, it didn't take long for fatigue and paranoia to breed distrust between the American supervisors and the foreign laborers. When a mechanized trawl malfunctioned and delayed a haul by several hours, accusations of sabotage were whispered and threats passed from one group to another. The thin line between discipline and humiliation blurred, especially during the so-called training drills for newcomers. These exercises, encouraged by the higher-ups, bordered on ritualized hazing, a mix of punishing workloads and public shaming, a perverse initiation that left many feeling more like prisoners than respectable workers. As the days blurred into nights, the first real confrontations erupted. Arguments over workload fairness, living quarters, or missed safety briefings escalated as patience ran dry. On one occasion, 2 Indonesian crew members nearly came to blows with a machinist from Nebraska, saved only by the intervention of First Mate Lee, whose bilingual skills and steady presence proved the crew's only pressure release. Even so, a sense of inevitability hung in the air, that sooner or later, unresolved grievances and unchecked aggression would boil over into something violent and uncontainable, lost between vast horizons where no one was truly safe. Peak of tension and beginning of tragedy. The mounting strain aboard the SS Pama reached a fever pitch as the days at sea stretched into weeks, eroding whatever thin patience remained among its crew. The already strained relationships between the officers and immigrant teams began to deteriorate into outright hostility, and the pervasive sense of isolation amplified grievances that might have otherwise remained minor on land. Every day brought a new humiliation or hardship: lost wages docked for minor infractions, public reprimands in front of crewmates, deprivation of sleep or rest as punishments, and the ever-present threat of contract termination and blacklisting. One particularly brutal incident unfolded when a trawl mishap, caused by a combination of rough weather and worn machinery, led to a partial loss of catch. Instead of addressing the equipment failure, the managers immediately blamed the Asian and Central American crews for their carelessness. Verbal insults quickly escalated to physical punishments. Captain Miller, usually content to let his subordinates keep order, shockingly joined the fray, publicly slapping a young Vietnamese deckhand and threatening mass firings if quotas were not met within the next cycle. The message was unmistakable. Mistakes, whether real or imagined, would not be tolerated. The atmosphere in the lower decks became stifling. Some workers began refusing meals, fearing that any small comfort could be construed as a privilege to be revoked. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, rumors of sabotage and conspiracy flourished. Some whispered that informants among their ranks were reporting back to the command staff, and every conversation seemed tinged with paranoia. The social fabric of the crew, already frayed by divisions of language and culture, began to unravel. At night, the ship felt less like a workplace and more like a prison. Security protocols became increasingly severe, ID checks grew more frequent, cameras monitored every common space, and the slightest deviation from drill or curfew was met with swift retaliation. When an Indonesian trawler hand was found asleep on the job, he was subjected to a staged humiliation in the mess. Forced to admit his laziness in front of everyone, his pay docked and shifts doubled. Instead of breaking his spirit, the ordeal became a catalyst for solidarity among the workers. Hushed discussions about rights, contracts, and dignity took shape in the shadowy corners of the vessel. Matters intensified when a group led by David Joe, under the pretense of seeking clarity over withheld wages, was summoned to the bridge, only to be browbeaten, threatened with legal action, and ordered to sign documents in a language most could not read. Realizing they were being baited into manufactured confessions of insubordination, Joe and his compatriots refused. Tensions boiled over, and on a storm-lashed night a confrontation exploded below deck. Shouts became shoves, shoves became blows, and all the pent-up fear and rage found its violent outlet. The resistance and its unexpected outcome. As the calendar crept toward the end of the second harrowing month at sea, resistance gradually replaced fear among the battered ranks of the Chinese crew. Exhausted, nursing wounds both visible and concealed, and with all hope of a fair resolution evaporating, their collective spirit hardened into resolve. The breaking point was reached with a fateful decision. Under the flickering ceiling lights of the lower deck, David Joe, a once timid schoolteacher now forged by adversity into an unlikely leader, gathered his fellow countrymen for a midnight council. Sleepless and desperate, they came together not as strangers from distant provinces, but as equal co-sufferers united by a common desperation to survive, whatever the cost. Each man bore the marks of humiliation, cuts, bruises, aching bones, and the invisible shame of enduring public reprimand for mere accidents. The core demand was simple: the right to disembark at the next port, regardless of forfeit, shame, or broken contract. It was a plea for dignity, not just a negotiation for wages or any hollow promise from the officers. Word of their intent quickly spread among the ship's immigrant ranks. Indonesian and Filipino workers, long relegated to the periphery yet themselves enduring the sting of harsh discipline, listened and whispered among their own. The air grew electric with rumor. Could something actually change? Would anyone dare challenge the old order and face down Will Johnson, whose rule on deck had always seemed absolute? But nothing on SS Pama ever happened in secret. Surveillance cameras and informants ensured the command staff was soon aware of the mounting unrest. Johnson and Captain Miller devised a solution, laced with corporate guile. They summoned the Chinese leaders to a tense meeting, presenting them with documents to sign, confessions written in rapid-fire legalese with threats of American prosecution hanging over every word. Sensing entrapment, Joe and his compatriots recoiled, refusing to betray themselves or admit to manufactured offenses. The visible defiance stunned the command staff. The confrontation ended not with an agreement, but with icy threats and a swift dispersal back to the bunks. What no one anticipated was how fully the last vestiges of patience would snap. That night, anger replaced fear. A spark, a muttered slur, the bang of a locker, a stumble in the dark, ignited the powder keg. Battered men who had entered quietly into their indentures burst out in a storm of violence. It began suddenly, a barrage of fists, the clatter of metal tools swept from workbenches, startled cries in Mandarin and Tagalog and English. The officers, caught entirely off guard, found themselves the targets of pent-up rage and years of unacknowledged injustice. Within the chaos, alliances shifted in an instant. Workers from other backgrounds joined in, some out of solidarity, some seizing a chance for reprisal. others just gripped by survival instinct and terror. Will Johnson, infamously hard and unyielding, was among the first to go down in the narrow hallway outside the officers' quarters. The violence was raw, uncoordinated, cathartic, a spectacle of suppressed humanity bursting its banks. By the time order returned, silence and devastation reigned in the place of brutality. Several members of the officer corps and a handful of American crew lay motionless, casualties not of premeditated mutiny, but of a ship's descent into lawlessness, unchecked abuse, and the desperate clamor for a life that meant more than just an expendable body at sea. After the fierce battle, control, and the power of life and death. In the eerie calm that followed the violent uprising aboard the SS Pama, the remnants of the crew faced an entirely new reality, one where the established order had been shattered, and survival depended on quick thinking, trust, and a grim calculus of necessity. The battered corridors and stained decks whispered of the night's chaos, but as dawn crested the waves, every survivor knew that what came next would define the rest of their lives. The Chinese faction, led by David Zhou and his close circle, emerged as the de facto authority, not out of ambition, but sheer circumstance. The American command was decimated, their power stripped as swiftly as their numbers. Indonesian and Filipino crew members, initially hesitant, rallied behind the new leadership, sensing that collaboration offered the only chance at resolution, or at least a semblance of safety, in the lawless expanse of open sea. No one wanted to play the hero. Decisions came heavy and fast: what to do with the injured, how to secure the officers who had survived. Would they attempt rescue, flee to the nearest port, or try to hide their mutiny by steering the ship toward less patrolled waters? The chain of command, once as rigid as the steel hull itself, was now a tenuous thread held together by whispered votes, desperate barter, and the mutual understanding that betrayal would mean disaster for all. David Zhou, reluctantly thrust into the role of commander, moved through the ship with an authority born not from charisma, but pain. He brokered tense truces between disparate groups, disarmed pockets of suspicion, and made the unthinkable decision to detain the American survivors in a storeroom. Medical supplies were rationed, the wounded tended as best as untrained hands could manage. Every action was shadowed by dread of retaliation. Were they already being tracked? Was there a distress signal sent before communications were silenced? Strategic debates raged in claustrophobic corners. Some argued they should attempt to negotiate surrender at the next foreign port, seeking asylum or leniency on humanitarian grounds. Others insisted on steering toward international waters, hoping to buy time and avoid immediate legal consequences. Arguments spiraled into raw emotional outbursts, but Zhou and his closest confidants clung to pragmatism. They had to keep everyone alive, avoid further violence, and pray their collective story might be heard beyond the fog of scandal. Desperation led the group to weigh each choice like a matter of life and death, because it was. The feeling was surreal. Hardly any of them had ever sought power, control, or notoriety. They were laborers, fathers, wayfarers, and now, by the accident of circumstance and the brutality of the sea, accidental arbiters of fate. Through sleepless watches, they took turns on the bridge, manned the engine room, prepared defenses in case of a counterattack, and tried to reach out, fruitlessly, to distant ships for help or witnesses. Outside, the sun glinted off a battered vessel adrift in the vastness, its fate uncertain. Inside, each survivor grasped the gravity of their situation. They were no longer just victims or perpetrators but custodians of a fragile order, bound together in an uneasy alliance until judgment, legal or otherwise, would find them. The sense of impending doom lingered as strong as the brine in the air, urging them to make decisions that would resonate, not just for themselves, but as echoes of justice, retribution, and the high human cost of desperation. Event remains: counterattack and struggle in desperation. In the grim aftermath of the mutiny on the SS Pama, the vessel's battered structure became a stage for a new, desperate kind of struggle. A frantic battle not with each other, but with the consequences of violence and the ticking clock of exposure. Harsh, salt-scented winds seemed now to carry the ghosts of what had transpired. The cries, the clash of bodies, and the sickening silence that followed. Instead of finding any peace, the survivors, Chinese, Indonesian, Filipino, and the few remaining Americans, confronted a fresh maelstrom of fear and uncertainty. Almost immediately, the shattered chain of command left a void at the ship's core. David Joe's group, now recognized as the unwilling leaders, struggled to maintain order and prevent chaos from erupting anew. They improvised a rotating system to monitor the bridge and engine rooms, kept separate groups from clashing, and rationed food as nerves frayed with suspicion. Conversation was scarce and only ever whispered, fears of betrayal or another coup lingering as heavily as the gloom itself. Hunger, weariness, and the still bleeding wounds from the battle gnawed constantly at bodies and minds alike. The medical supplies were woefully insufficient. Makeshift bandages, scavenged painkillers, and primitive care were all that could be offered. Grief mingled with dread, some haunted by guilt over the violence, others wrestling with the surreal reality that they had become, in the world's eyes, criminals and pariahs. Efforts at damage control, the attempted repair of the ship's communications, patching hull leaks, or even keeping the engines rumbling, became exercises in futility. Each technical setback was not just a mechanical problem, but a blow to collective hope. Paranoia surfaced. Accusations of sabotage or collusion were quietly exchanged behind closed doors. Still, the memory of shared hardship forged pockets of solidarity wherein men who might have once eyed each other with distrust now shared a silent truce against the greater threat from without. The anxiety of impending outside intervention haunted every waking moment. The crew speculated endlessly about the ship's fate, whether authorities had detected their plight, if help or retribution was en route, or if, in a chilling turn, they had truly vanished from the notice of the world. Desperate, a few plotted escape. One American, battered and frightened, attempted to slip away on a lifeboat under cover of night, only to trigger alarms and cast further suspicion among the ranks. It was during these agonizing hours that the full human cost of the mutiny crystallized. Every decision, to trust, to ration, to withhold, or to confess, became fraught with existential risk. Many wrestled with thoughts of home, families who would never understand how such savagery came to pass. Some prayed for rescue, others for oblivion. Yet, within this crucible of suffering and dread, dignity sparked in small, unexpected moments. A shared blanket, a nod of reassurance, a muttered apology. In time, the inescapable reality dawned. There would be no return to ordinary life for anyone on board. What remained was a single, urgent imperative: to survive the aftermath, cling to some sliver of justice or understanding, and hope that, when the world finally looked their way, someone would see more than just the headlines or the blood on the deck. Statement, trial, and judgment. In the cold fluorescent light of the federal courtroom in Seattle, the surviving Chinese crew members were thrust into a foreign and hostile world, their faces haunted by exhaustion and disbelief. News of the SS Pama incident had already exploded across international headlines: a violent mutiny, multiple deaths, accusations of murder and piracy. On the day of testimony, the courthouse was ringed with security, TV cameras clustered like scavengers, and protesters wielding hand-painted placards. Inside, everything was conducted according to the rigid choreography of American justice. The proceedings were labyrinthine and daunting. A battery of government prosecutors painted the 6 Chinese defendants in broad strokes as ringleaders of a premeditated massacre, stoking public outrage with grainy evidence, photos from the blood-slicked decks, and shaky video feeds from the ship's security cameras. Each piece of evidence was wielded not just as proof, but as a weapon designed to destroy sympathy and reinforce an already poisonous narrative. Foreign laborers turned killers in pursuit of money. The defense team, a patchwork of public defenders, passionate pro bono lawyers, and translating volunteers, fought an uphill battle. Their arguments focused on the double bind the workers had faced: forced labor, brutalization, relentless humiliation, and the sheer terror that exploded in those final hours. But few in the room seemed willing to see nuance. The chorus outside, victims' relatives, labor rights activists, anti-immigrant demonstrators, permeated every deliberation. Testimonies took a heavy toll. David Joe, the reluctant spokesman, sat haggard in the witness box. Through a translator, he described the arc of suffering that began long before the violence ever did. A tale of deception by overseas recruiters, contract trickery, and a slow descent into a waking nightmare on the Pama. But prosecutors pressed him remorselessly, forcing him to recount the bloodiest moments, replaying the violence over and over, each time stripping context away. For the American survivors, the wounded officers and the families of the dead, anger and grief dominated their time on the stand. Some shouted, others wept openly for lost sons or brothers, demanding the harshest possible sentence. It was not only a trial of 6 men, but a complex and uncomfortable reckoning with the dark underbelly of American labor practices at sea, the exploitation that thrived where oversight faltered. Yet, within the echoing wood panels of the courtroom, abstraction quickly lost out to appetite for closure. The jury was asked to decide not just on questions of guilt, but to pass judgment on an entire world they could barely comprehend, months of psychological attrition giving way in a single catastrophic act. Media coverage reduced the drama to sound bites: Pacific butchers caught, bloody mutiny at sea, squelching whatever doubt or sympathy survived. The verdict, when it came, was as severe as the public had come to expect: guilty on multiple counts, murder, insurrection, destruction of property, and conspiracy. The sentences ranged from life without parole for Joe to decades behind American bars for the others, their fates sealed by a system that recognized neither their desperation nor the system's own complicity. Appeals were filed, motions for leniency debated in the press, and rights organizations issued critical reports, but little changed in the face of a story so tainted by violence and fear. No justice could truly be done for anyone in a case where every side lost, and the ocean that had swallowed the Pama's promise offered no comfort, only the possibility that its darkest lessons might still be ignored. In the months and years following the Pama tragedy, ripples of the incident continued to unsettle not only the American maritime industry, but also broader debates on labor rights, immigration policy, and the very soul of a country built by waves of newcomers. Newsrooms and editorial columns returned again and again to the haunting images of that battered vessel and the desperate faces of its surviving crew, men who, for a brief moment, became both the symbols of exploitation and the catalyst for national reckoning. Regulators and lawmakers, pressed by both union advocates and an outraged public, launched sweeping reviews into working practices on American-flagged and foreign-flagged ships operating within U.S. waters. Congressional hearings summoned grim testimony from survivors and families, sobering everyone with first-hand accounts of sleep deprivation, fear, and violence passed off as discipline. Industry leaders, eager to avoid both lawsuits and continued scrutiny, scrambled to implement surface-level reforms, stricter background checks for contractors, more frequent safety audits, and cultural sensitivity trainings that, to the cynical, seemed like little more than window dressing. Yet real systemic change proved elusive. While a handful of the worst labor brokers and abusive officers found themselves banned or faced token criminal charges, countless other crews, hailing from new shores, often even more vulnerable than their predecessors, continued to endure silent suffering. Stories leaked periodically of wage theft, beatings, and shipboard deaths swept under carpets of bureaucracy. The promise of Hemingway-esque adventure receded, replaced by a more troubling narrative: the myth of the just, upwardly mobile America buckling under the weight of its own contradictions. Meanwhile, advocacy groups and investigative journalists kept the issue alive, pressing for laws with real teeth: whistleblower protections for migrant workers, independent monitors aboard high-risk vessels, and cross-border agreements on labor enforcement. These conversations began to alter public perception even as the political winds grew fickle, at times sympathetic to the plight of the oppressed, at other moments fixated on border security and the supposed threat posed by desperate migrants. The Pama case's notoriety made it harder for anyone to claim ignorance, but it did not translate easily into lasting empathy or policy. For the American public, the memory of the tragedy lingered awkwardly at the periphery of national discourse. In classrooms, law schools, and HR seminars, the case was analyzed as both a legal puzzle and a moral one. How much blame fell on rogue individuals, and how much on the system itself? Could any society that reaped the benefits of global trade truly absolve itself of the costs borne by invisible hands halfway around the world? On the West Coast docks, older workers told the story as a cautionary tale, reminding young men and women that the sea offered riches, but always at a price, often exacted from the least powerful among them. And for the families of the lost and accused, nothing could ever quite heal the wounds or erase the sense that the fight for dignity and fairness was perpetual, unfinished, and as boundless as the ocean itself.